October 17th, 2024, 7:03 p.m. Presidential Palace, Ouagadougou. The chandelier above the banquet table trembled, though no one noticed it yet. A silver fork clinked against a porcelain plate. President Ibrahim Traoré had just taken the first bite of his meal when his chest tightened like iron jaws. His throat burned. A whisper of dread swept through the hall, too quiet to hear, but everyone felt it. He had been poisoned. The guards reached for their weapons. Ministers froze mid-sentence. The president's hand trembled. A glass tipped over. Chaos erupted. Within seconds, orders were shouted, "Seal the palace." No one in, no one out. Burkina Faso, a nation rising from decades of silence, now teetered on the edge of its own breath. In the hospital's secure wing, monitors beeped beside Traoré's unconscious body. But the story didn't end there. In a modest home miles away, an old man shut off the radio. Maurice Sankara, once purged, once betrayed, once branded a traitor, sat still. His eyes held no fear, only memory. He didn't speak, but the air around him seemed to hum, "They will come, and I will rise." Just hours later, a knock. Black cars, military escorts. The enemies of yesterday needed the man they once buried. And he knew why, because he had nothing left to lose except his honor. The poison had a name and a purpose, and behind it voices whispered, "Rejecting the CFA Frank is economic suicide. He's too close to Russia. You can't win against France." Sankara's reply was simple, soft, but thunderous. "Then we'll be the first." This was no longer about one man. It was the heartbeat of a continent rising again. Africa's pulse would not be silenced. Maurice Sankara stood alone in the palace garden beneath the shade of a baobab tree. The city noise was muffled by the thick walls. He could still smell smoke in the wind, anger from the streets, fear in the corridors, and something else. The stale scent of old betrayals resurfacing. But he didn't shout. He didn't throw accusations, not yet. Instead, he listened to the soil, to the silence between heartbeats, to the voice of his homeland, which had watched colonizers draw borders with rulers, then return with contracts cloaked in smiles. He had once believed silence was surrender. But today his stillness became his armor. He had been burned before. This time he would choose when to speak and when to strike. That night he didn't return home. He walked the halls of the investigation wing long after the others had left. His eyes scanned every file, every name, until they blurred into a map of deception. But his mind was clear. Traitors wore suits. They dined at state dinners and toasted with imported wine. And while the president lay on a hospital bed, one of them had booked a 5-star suite in Paris. Sankara's voice, when it finally came, was low, deliberate. Not for effect, but for truth. "We faked the president's death," he said to the small team around him. They froze. "And we bait the hand behind the poison." There was no applause, no protest, just wide eyes, then nods. Only a man with nothing left to lose could think of such a plan. And only a man with everything to protect would dare to carry it out. The trap was set. Over the next 48 hours, the Ministry of Health released carefully worded statements. Unstable condition, life support, prepare for national mourning. The people wept. The streets filled with candles and chorus songs of grief. But beneath it all, a fire stirred. Not despair, defiance. Burkina Faso was learning to cry and clench its fist at the same time. And miles away in Paris, the message landed. A diplomat packed his bags, a condolence visit was arranged, documents prepared, gold rights, military deals. They thought they were signing the future. What they didn't know was that the future now had a face. And his name was Maurice Sankara. He wasn't a hero sculpted in marble. He was flesh. He was contradiction. He had once wanted revenge, but now he wanted something bigger. Justice. Africa didn't need another savior. It needed someone who remembered what it felt like to kneel and vowed never to kneel again. If you felt the pulse of Burkina Faso in these words, hit subscribe to stand with the story. Comment where you're watching from. Africa sees you. And share this with someone who believes freedom must be defended even in silence. 2 days after the fake announcement of President Traoré's death, the palace fell into a calculated hush. Ministers wore black, the national flag draped in mourning. Radio stations played slow balafon music. From Bobo Dioulasso to Kaya elders wept beside burning incense, children lit candles outside mosques, and the air in Ouagadougou itself was heavy with grief. But under the quiet, every corridor of the presidential compound pulsed with anticipation. And Sankara waited until the call came. He's here. The French diplomat Pierre Dumont had entered Burkina Faso posing as a cultural envoy. But everyone in the room knew who he truly was. French intelligence, a man whose handshake could rewrite history. He stepped into the prime minister's office like he belonged there. Smooth suit, controlled voice, condolences rehearsed. But what he walked into was no ordinary meeting. Dumont sat across from Prime Minister Dio, flanked by two silent men in traditional Faso Dan Fani robes. One of them was Sankara. Dumont glanced briefly at him, dismissed him as a bodyguard. He spoke with forced grief. "It is a tragic day for the African continent. France shares your sorrow." Sankara remained still. Dumont then pulled a leather folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table. Inside documents, contracts, agreements that would hand back the gold fields of the East to French mining giants, military base renewal, a new security assistance program. Dio reached for the folder. Sankara's voice cut through the room. "Don't touch it." Dumont turned startled. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" Maurice Sankara stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't move fast. He simply reached into a side drawer and pulled out a voice recorder. He pressed play. Dumont's own voice filled the room. "Are you sure is Traoré really dead? This is excellent news. I'll be on the next flight. We can finalize the agreements once the Prime Minister is in control." The color drained from Dumont's face. "I want my lawyer," he whispered. "I'm not a judge," Sankara replied coldly. "I'm the proof that Africa remembers." Before Dumont could speak again, the side door opened, and President Ibrahim Traoré walked in. Pale, thinner, but standing, alive. Dumont stumbled back. His mouth moved, but no words came. Traoré didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He looked Dumont in the eye and said, "You tried to poison a people. But the people are awake now. What followed would be spoken of for years. The arrest of a French intelligence agent in the heart of West Africa. The collapse of the silent deals. The official expulsion of foreign military presence. And most of all, the moment two former enemies, Traoré and Sankara, stood side by side not in vengeance but in vigilance. From the dust of betrayal they had birthed something few expected: unity forged in truth. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about Africa rewriting its story from the inside. And for once the world had no choice but to watch. The news broke before noon. A foreign intelligence agent had been exposed on African soil in the presidential palace of Burkina Faso. The man had arrived to sign secret deals. Instead, he was handcuffed and escorted through the capital under full military watch. By sundown, the streets of Ouagadougou were flooded with people. Not mourning this time, but marching. Flags waved high, red, green, and gold. Children on their fathers' shoulders chanted Ibrahim Traoré's name. Elders beat talking drums under neem trees. Market women sang old freedom songs, the ones their mothers had taught them under French rule. And above it all, murals began to appear overnight. One of Sankara and Traoré side by side. Another of Dumont in chains beneath the words, "Burkina is not for sale." But it didn't stop in Burkina. In Bamako, youth gathered in front of the French embassy with placards reading, "No more puppets." In Niamey, radio stations cut their playlists to broadcast the speech of President Traoré on repeat. If they cannot poison our food, they try to poison our sovereignty. Across the continent, leaders took notice. The President of Guinea issued a public statement applauding Burkina Faso's bold defense of African self-determination. Civic groups in Senegal began pushing for a parliamentary review of all foreign mining contracts. Even in South Africa, ANC youth wings invoked Thomas Sankara's name with renewed purpose. "We must finish what he began." International media scrambled. European commentators used to Africa as a footnote now rushed panels on African independence. "What does this mean for the CFA Frank?" one British anchor asked. Could this ignite a continental backlash? In Paris, the French government issued a nervous statement calling Dumont a rogue actor. But nobody was buying it. Not anymore. Because for the first time in decades, a small landlocked nation had stared down a G7 power and stood tall. Burkina Faso was no longer the silent zone on the map. It had become a spark, and people were catching fire. In classrooms across Africa, students replayed the footage. Sankara calmly pressing play on the recording. Traoré walking in pale but unbroken. It didn't feel like politics. It felt like prophecy fulfilled. In Nairobi, an old professor at the University of Nairobi stood before his lecture hall and said, "You're not watching news. You're watching history." Africa just remembered her own name. But the wave wasn't only emotional. Concrete change followed. Burkina Faso formally announced the termination of military basing rights for foreign armies. A regional coalition began drafting plans for a joint West African mineral reserve under African control. Young people once cynical were registering to vote, organizing neighborhood forums, asking older generations for stories not of despair, but of resistance. And through it all, a message echoed louder with each sunrise. We are not poor, we've just been robbed. And now we remember who took it. From the depths of betrayal, a continent was beginning to speak as one, and this time the whole world had to listen. 6 months passed, but the moment never faded. Across Burkina Faso, the word sovereignty no longer belonged to speeches. It became a rhythm heard in classrooms, carved into bus stops, painted on market walls. People no longer whispered about justice, they walked with it. President Ibrahim Traoré returned to office not just as a survivor, but as a symbol. His once divided cabinet now sat around one table, realigned by the fire they had walked through. And beside him stood Maurice Sankara, once exiled, now national security advisor, a man who had buried his bitterness to serve something greater than revenge. Together they had broken the silence, but they didn't stop there. A new civic code was passed, banning foreign ownership of vital resources. The Ministry of Education launched the Roots of Freedom curriculum, teaching students the stories of Thomas Sankara, Amilcar Cabral, Miriam Makeba, not as distant figures but as seeds of identity. In Dori, young women in traditional Coco Dunda fabric trained in political debate clubs named the Phoenix Circles. In Gawa, gold miners began forming cooperatives protected by a new law that ensured 70% of profits stayed local. And on national radio, farmers from Kodogu called in to share indigenous farming techniques, reclaiming knowledge once dismissed as primitive. Burkina Faso wasn't just recovering, it was becoming, and the ripple kept going. At the African Union Summit, Traoré took the stage not with prepared notes, but with the truth etched in his lungs. They tried to silence one voice, but they woke a continent. The room erupted not in formality, but in applause born of recognition. Here was a new kind of African leader, not perfect, not polished, but present, and willing to bleed for the soil beneath his feet. Journalists who once wrote Africa off as a crisis continent now ran stories titled The Burkina Doctrine, when integrity became contagious, and in the villages, stories changed. Grandmothers in Bobo spoke of the day the president rose from the dead. Children played games where they reenacted Sankara confronting foreign agents. One boy in a village near Tenkodogo stood in front of a cardboard camera and declared, "Africa is not for sale." This was the harvest of defiance, not just reforms or headlines, but a generation raised on courage. Under the same baobab tree where Sankara once stood in silence, he now gathered with university students. He didn't lecture, he listened. "You are not inheriting a broken Africa," he said. "You are inheriting one that finally knows its worth." And in that silence, soft and sacred, something shifted. Africa had bled, but now it was blooming. If this story moved, you don't let it stop here. Subscribe for more untold truths of African courage. Like to honor the resilience of our people. Share to keep the spirit alive across borders. The future is watching. Let's write it together. On a quiet evening in Ouagadougou, as the red sun dipped below the Sahel horizon, President Traoré stood alone by the palace gate. A little girl approached barefoot, carrying a wooden doll, her dress patched but clean. She didn't speak. She simply looked up, raised her hand, and offered him a white stone. "No one can steal the land if we hold it together," she whispered. It was something her grandmother had told her during the crisis. A saying buried in old village memory, now reborn through a child's lips. That moment stayed with him. Because that stone was not just a symbol, it was a vow. For months, fear had paralyzed the country, fear of foreign hands, of betrayal within, of weakness exposed. But now fear was fading. In its place, clarity, community, and courage. Across Burkina Faso, 1.2 million citizens had downloaded the new Wakanda Wallet, a sovereign digital banking app launched weeks after the Dumont scandal. 7 universities revised their national history curricula to include modern resistance movements starting with Sankara and Traoré. 5 West African nations began negotiations to replace the CFA franc with a pan-African gold-backed currency. In Kaya, a village school once funded by European NGOs was now rebuilt by local cooperatives brick by brick with hands that finally knew their worth. Change was no longer an idea. It was a pattern, a new language on the continent's tongue. And Sankara, no longer the man in exile, no longer the shadow behind the strategy, stood in front of a class of final-year students at the University of Ouagadougou, his voice quiet but certain. Revolution isn't a moment, it's a habit. And freedom isn't something we win, it's something we protect together every single day. He paused, looked at their faces. Faces that mirrored the continent itself, fierce, bright, unfinished. They poisoned our water, but we turned it into wine. The lecture ended, but the students stayed seated. Because some words don't need applause. They need remembering. Outside murals now bore a new phrase, "We are the future our grandmothers prayed for." This story is no longer just about one man who survived a poisoning. It's about a people who woke up before it was too late. It's about an Africa that no longer asks permission to rise. It's about us. And now the baton is in your hands. Will you listen when your homeland calls your name? Will you challenge the history written without you? Will you hold the line when the world tries to redraw it? Because one thing is clear. They tried to silence one voice, but the echo became a movement. And now, we speak in thunder. Africa is not waiting. Africa is becoming. And you are part of that becoming.